So thank you everyone for joining us today. Sorry about the quick couple of text issues, but we've got an amazing group of panelists today who have been working deeply in the space to combat disinformation and misinformation, and I'm really excited for them to share all their work. We have seen how disinformation and misinformation has influenced our country over the past 4 years. It's contributed to the polarization of our citizens here in the US. It's undermined the ability for people to discern what is true, and has laid
Uh-oh.
It's laid the groundwork. She was right on the cusp of laying it all out.
Lori, if you can hear us, we've lost you.
I have a draft of her opening remarks. Should I go ahead and give them?
Yeah, so do I.
I guess I'll just, I will continue with her remarks. We've seen how disinformation and misinformation has influenced our country. Oh, there she is.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so basically, all right, so I can't remember where I exactly stopped, but I'm basically more and more people right now are getting their information on social media, places like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, Snapchat, and you know, this is where rampant disinformation is happening. So in a recent poll of 1,000 voters by Accountable Tech, we have 74% of respondents believe that disinformation is an extremely serious problem for our country. 67% think the platforms have not done enough to protect democracy, and 84% believe that the social media platforms have contributed to the radicalization. And the good news is that we are actually we have champions in this space who you're going to hear from. So let's turn to our panel. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then turn it over first to Jake Davey. So just by introduction in alpha order, Carolyn Chambers is a senior advisor at Catalyst, where she specializes in approaches to combat online disinformation. She's led the domestic policy advocacy for the Open Society Foundation and its affiliated 501c4 and the Policy Center for 9 years before coming to OSF. She worked in the White House as Director of Confirmations for President Obama, overseeing Senate approval for 600 nominees for high-level administration positions. She's had significant roles on Capitol Hill as well, and recently Carolyn has stood up and directs the Tolerance Fund, which works to promote tolerance, understanding, and respect in honor of her late mother-in-law, who was a Holocaust survivor. Jacob Davey is head of research and policy of far-right and hate movements for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, an independent nonprofit research organization dedicated to safeguarding human rights and reversing the tide of polarization, extremism, and disinformation worldwide. His research focuses on the role of digital communications and intercommunal conflict, internet culture, online hate speech, and the international far right. Some of you may have seen Jake's work in the report Hosting the Holohoax, a snapshot of denial across social media, as well as other publications, The Guardian, The Independent, and the BBC. Jessica Gonzalez is an attorney, a racial justice advocate, and co-CEO of Free Press, whose mission is building media and technology that serve truth and justice. Jessica is a leader in the fight to push tech companies to crack down on hate and disinformation. She co-founded the Change the Terms Coalition, a coalition of more than 60 civil and digital rights groups that work to disrupt online hate, helped lead Stop Hate for Profit campaign's Facebook advertising boycott, and sits on the Real Facebook Oversight Board. Jessica has testified before Congress on multiple occasions, including net neutrality, media ownership, diversity, and affordable internet access. And last but by certainly not least, Ann Ravel. Ann is a practicing attorney and currently leads the Decode Democracy's project to tackle online disinformation. Ann served as the Federal Election Commission served on the Federal Election Commission from 2013 to 2017, holding the roles of vice chair and chair. She previously chaired the California Fair Political Practices Commission, has served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Department of Justice, and served as Santa Clara County Counsel for over a decade. Anne regularly writes and speaks on the topics of digital deception and democracy and political transparency, and has appeared in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Sacramento Bee, the San Jose Mercury News, as well as appearing on numerous TV, radio, and other media presentations. So you can tell we have an esteemed panel today, a lot to say. And in the meantime, what I'm going to ask, starting with Jake, is just for folks to do a quick overview of what they're seeing in the digital disinformation space, both current trends and what you think is important for panelists who want to work on this issue need to know.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction, Laurie, and good afternoon to everyone from London. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this is working. Can someone say whether or not you can see my slides?
We see it.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to talk quite briefly in a couple of minutes, I guess, about the trends we're seeing, more specifically relating to anti-Semitism and hate at ISD. So the way we approach our work here is very much through having ongoing insights and generating analysis around what we see relating to hate, extremism, and disinformation, but then also working to translate those insights into actionable, innovative solutions to push back against hate and extremism online. Where we are globally at the moment is we're seeing a surge in hatred, with the US very much fitting this pattern. The FBI hate crime statistics point towards hate crime being at a 10-year high currently. And this is also tied to a surging extreme right-wing movement, which is really working to drive hatred and push othering conceptions of minority communities online. And really at the Institute, what we see here is this is intimately tied to social media use. Extremists and sort of broader communities operate across a wide range of social media platforms, obviously Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, but also fringe platforms specifically designed for extremist use, such as Parler, for example. And really, looking at these platforms, we see that the surge in hatred is intimately tied both to sort of coordinated disinformation and conspiracy campaigns, deliberate pushes by extremist groups to change the tone and nature of conversation online, as well as more organic movements. Very briefly, just on anti-Semitism in general, and I've tried to keep this to top-line trends rather than sort of too much nasty content, which I think no one really wants to see on their Sunday afternoon. But really, when we look at anti-Semitism, but also hatred writ large, the COVID-19 pandemic has correlated massively with sharp increases in hateful activity online. What I think is really important to spell out here is how hatred and disinformation are becoming increasingly hybridized as well. So it's not just a case that you'll have people doing hate speech, but this as a threat is intimately tied to coordinated disinformation campaigns and the mass proliferation of conspiracy theories. And we've really seen this hypercharge in COVID at times when people are spending more time online and are also anxious around the world that they see it and looking for sort of easy solutions and answers for why this is. And unfortunately, this is correlated with a massive surge of anti-Semitic speech online, as well as hate speech targeting other minority communities as well. In particular, conspiracy theories and disinformation around the pandemic have provided a new vehicle for old anti-Semitic tropes. So this includes blaming the pandemic on Jewish elites, as well as the resurgence of blood libel narratives relating to the vaccine and conspiracy theories there. And this graph at the bottom is just one example of this, of what this looks like last year. And it's sort of showing a conversation relating to the idea of Jewish elites being related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what you see is that around March and April, this conversation really surged, and that sort of surge in the volume of speech is something which we're still seeing. Sort of leave this as my provocation for the end, though. Really, in that hosting hatred by these platforms, by platforms such as Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, is a decision. as very much is refusing to take action. And here I just want to sort of draw an example from some of the research which Laurie mentioned. So in the case of Holocaust denial content, action by platforms had a really demonstrable impact on how easy the content could be found. So we did analysis across platforms, and we found that while Facebook had a persistent community of Holocaust deniers on the platform, and indeed Facebook's recommendation algorithms were promoting this content, the decision to have this up here is very much a decision of Facebook and by Facebook. And what we were able to find for an analysis of YouTube is that very quickly and very easily, when they made the decision that this content is unacceptable to be hosted on the platform, much all mentions of Holocaust denial material dropped off pretty much overnight. And so really I have this as my provocation, because platforms do have the power through changing terms of services and through enforcement to limit the spread of vile hatred online. And hopefully that will sort of open up the conversation with the rest of the panelists. So thank you everyone for taking the time.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Jessica, can I turn to you next?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lori. And thanks to the JCPA for having me here today. I know I don't need to tell anyone here that hate and disinformation are not new tactics. They've been around for a very long time. That's why Holocaust denial is popular among a certain subset of people. It's why, the media environment ahead of slavery, ahead of Native genocide, ahead of Mexican repatriation, was rife with hate and disinformation aimed at those groups. I came to this work in the 2000s, where the right-wing extremists were using immigration as a tactic to recruit more people. And we saw a ton of hate aimed at the Latinx and immigrant communities, primarily at the time over radio and cable news, and then a dramatic uptick in hate crimes against our communities. So disinformation and hate, not a new phenomenon, still very prevalent over radio, TV, etc. What is new about the online space? And I would say, here's the key. Social media platforms have figured out how to monetize hate and disinformation. They've also got a business model built on extracting our personal behavioral data and demographic data and targeting us based on what they perceive to be our vulnerabilities, based on the massive amounts of information that they're collecting on us. So they're actually, it's less of a passive consumption of hate and disinformation, but a very targeted one. So for instance, a report that came out of Facebook itself that was leaked last year by the Wall Street Journal found that 64% of people who find extremist content on Facebook find that because of Facebook's own algorithms, their own recommendation system is driving people to hateful content or disinformation based on their perceived vulnerabilities and things that they might be sensitive to believing or taking on. So the question is why? And I think we know that Facebook and other platforms have built hate and lie for profit business models. They're not the first. We have Fox News, Sinclair, iHeartRadio, lots of different media entities employ this business model across their platforms. What's new is that it's targeted, it's sophisticated, and they can stop it. Yes, it's third-party content, but I agree with Jacob's premise that the companies can put rules in place to take down hate and disinformation. They're deciding not to because it's good for their bottom line. So that is why many folks have joined across communities, Jewish community, Muslim community, people of color, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, have joined together in various coalition spaces to demand better from these platforms, to demand accountability and transparency about what's happening there, and frankly, to demand some accountability all the way up to the federal government.
So much, Jessica. And let me turn to you for some perspective on this.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and thanks for the invitation. I think obviously everything that Jacob and Jessica said are exactly right about hate speech and about the targeting of vulnerable minorities in particular, as well as Jews. I came to this issue when I was vice chair of the Federal Election Commission, and I had sort of innocuously realized that a lot of political campaigning was going to the internet, and this was in 2014. And so I wrote a statement about how we needed to look at the issue of political campaigns on the internet and the internet itself, as well as platforms, and make decisions by talking to academics and people who were also in technology to figure out a solution to this so that the laws that applied to political campaigns were applicable on the internet. One of my fellow commissioners went on Fox News twice to say that I was censoring the internet. And as a result, I got millions of death threats, anti-Semitic. He obviously also said that I was Jewish, anti-Semitic comments, as well as YouTube videos showing me as Hitler, and a lot of misogyny as well. And that made me recognize what the issue was. And the fact is, the way I view it is only not just about the hate and the violence that has been promulgated on the internet since on these platforms, but also because there's a connection to politics. And we know that there's a close connection to our political system and the desire of these right-wing groups, not only to spew hatred against women and minorities, but also to undermine our democracy. And they're doing a pretty good job of it, actually. And we saw that in January 6th. We saw it here in California earlier than that, with a group called the Boogaloo Boys, whose they started off as a right-wing, alt-right kind of group that was basically anti-government. And as a result, they were able to organize on Facebook. And Facebook essentially says, if it's real people, they didn't stop it. They didn't take it. They took down some of the communications, but they did not take down the group as a whole, just as the same that happened years later with January 6th, because they believed that their real issue had to do with fake accounts. But in fact, now we know these individuals are brazenly using the platform and some of the also smaller platforms and kind of dark web platforms, but they are able to utilize Facebook. And what they did in the case of the Boogaloo Boys was to plan violent attacks against police officers and other government officials that succeeded. There were a lot of murders involved there. And so we cannot forget that what is happening by all of this is hate and violence, but also a very serious effort by those groups to impact our democracy, and it seems to be effective and working, because there's much less trust in institutions in our country. There's a lot less acknowledgement of what is truth and what isn't truth in both the political system and in other issues. And it really weakens democratic participation. So I could go on, but I know we have more questions, so I'll stop there.
Thanks. And then let me just our initial, outing with Carolyn, and especially some of the work that you're seeing, in Congress and across, state houses.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you all. And I have a little presentation here. Let me see if I can share my screen. So lots of harms on social media. You've just heard a lot of them. And they're increasing. And I think the overwhelming reaction is somebody needs to do something about this. But the question is who and what, and are we likely to see changes anytime soon? On the what, I think it's important to understand there are a number of factors involved. So there isn't a single solution. And I noticed this in the comments already. That's some very smart participants here pointing out that you can push a balloon in one place and it will pop out somewhere else. There are generally 3 areas of problems and remedies that fall in these areas. First, how do we make social media safer for users and for society? How do we address dangerous content posted on social media that isn't necessarily illegal, but is clearly harmful? And how do we bring some measure of accountability so that hate and disinformation do not continue to proliferate while also protecting the right to free speech? Second, how do we give consumers more power over the highly personal information being collected about us and how that information is shared and used by big tech companies? They are literally making billions of dollars in profits by monetizing our data. And they do this in ways that increase polarization, extremism, and opportunities for discrimination. And third, how do we give consumers more choice? The first 2 problems I mentioned are made worse by the market power of the biggest companies. Consumers have very little choice if they want a safer, more private online experience. So who are the primary actors here and who can play a role in making some of these changes? The first platforms themselves, and over the year, particularly the last year, consumers, advertisers, employees have put increasing pressure on the companies to act. But the shaming and the boycotts haven't been enough. The social media CEOs have become very good at making promises in highly publicized statements and in congressional hearings. But those promises turn out to be half measures and are seldom effectively enforced. COVID and vaccine disinformation, voting and election lies, militia organizing, and incitements to violence, all of these are violations of the platform's own rules right now, but they're still rampant. So these pressure campaigns are important and must continue, but ultimately, we need government to step in to create rules that are legally enforceable. So here are the primary players who could force reform, and I'll try and go through them quickly. The Biden administration has signaled it wants to act. Candidate Biden was very critical of the platforms, and President Biden now has hired prominent critics of tech for high-level government posts. But there are few laws on the books for the new administration to enforce. Last year, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission brought antitrust cases against Google and Facebook. And there's every reason to believe the Biden administration will aggressively support these and investigate new antitrust cases as well. But litigation moves incredibly slowly. The government's case against Google, for instance, isn't due to go to trial until September of 2023. The FTC has Consumer Protection Authority. It imposed a $5 billion fine on Facebook over the Cambridge Analytica data breach, for example, and it might be able to do more. This is encouraging, but there are real limits to what the administration can do without new laws. So Congress has the most power to make meaningful reforms, but it's extremely difficult to get them to act. even after facing an attempted insurrection that was fueled by social media. There appears to be broad agreement that the platforms are too powerful and should face rules, but there's little agreement on what those new rules should be. This is clearest on the issue of moderating content. Current federal law gives platforms immunity from any liability for harms caused by the content on their platform. It also protects them from lawsuits over decisions they make to remove content. Biden has called for repeal of that law. Others want to see it curtailed, but the debate is quite partisan, with Democrats generally feeling the platforms are not doing enough to remove harmful posts, and the Republicans generally feeling the platforms are removing too much. There are a number of different proposals, which I can go into if people are interested later on how to address this, but moving right along. There's bipartisan interest in enacting a federal digital privacy law, but it's not been made a real priority. So right now, most of the legislative activity on privacy is happening at the state level. And perhaps the best chance for federal legislation is in the area of antitrust. House Judiciary Committee did very high-profile series of hearings and recently completed a lengthy investigation into big tech companies, finding they're engaging in unfair practices to disadvantage competitors. So we may see something there.
Carolyn, I just want to get quick 30 seconds heads up so we can move on to some of the Q&A.
Great. So the courts are also an interesting avenue. I think it's noteworthy that the civil rights group Muslim Advocates just filed a novel suit against Facebook that tries to get around some of these legal liability claims. The states are very involved in the antitrust lawsuits, but they are also facing in state legislatures efforts to curtail what they see as censorship of conservative speech. So I will stop there. Just quick nod to the European Union, which is way ahead of the US in considering a regulatory framework here. They may act by the end of the year in ways that could have beneficial effects for the US. So I will leave it there. Sorry.
No, great. Thanks so much. I mean, there's so much here to explore. So Jessica, let me turn it to you for a second. I know when we were all speaking earlier, you talked about sort of the interconnectedness of the moment. And I think, given that Caroline has sort of landed on the European Union and the global movement, how do and I see people putting also, information on the state laws happening in California. How do all these work together to a place that we might actually, get to some solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key, and as an activist, you won't be surprised, is that the key is we have to organize and demand action from the ground up. I do see that happening, and we're building the infrastructure. These are global companies. I think in an idea, they would like to have a global set of rules that may or may not make sense or be the best for the users of those services or our respective democracies. But I think action in the EU or the UK could have a global impact, and we do have to look at this from an intersecting framework. And here's what I mean by that. Yes, I think it's true that social media are huge drivers of disinformation. But when I look at the U.S. context and I examine our media ecosystem, I think there's fractures that need to be solved in addition to legislation to reform the behavior of the social media companies. So in the last 12 years, we've lost over 50% of local journalists in the United States. And so there's a real lack of information that is serving the information needs of local communities across the country. And in to fill that void is all this toxic, false garbage. And so we actually need to think about reinvesting in our non-commercial journalism sector. And that's why one of the proposals, I like the 3 interventions that Carolyn laid out. But another thing that Free Press has been talking a lot about is taxing big tech for the toxins they're putting out into the information ecosystem and redistributing that money to serve local communities with quality news and information, because I think people really are trying to get a handle on what's going on. I hear that just in my own family and friends. Like, I had someone who shall remain nameless calling me to say, this whole microchip and the vaccine thing, that's not real, right? And so, we're having these conversations with our community and seeing how the information ecosystem is both actively serving false information, but also not providing the quality news that folks need. And the truth is, when you look at the Pew studies, people really trust local broadcast TV still, but we're getting mostly a bunch of fear, fluff, traffic, and weather, and not a lot else. So we actually need to beef up the system. I will just take the 230 question and then send it back to you, Lori. This isn't my favorite intervention. I'm nervous about repeal of Section 230 because the way it worked before we had 230 in place was that if platforms moderated content at all, they became liable. So I don't want to do anything that disincentivizes them from actually moderating content. I think there's probably some targeted modifications that can help curb some of this behavior. But I'd also say 230 doesn't protect them from their algorithms driving discrimination, hate, voter interference, all those things. And so we actually, I am interested in the courts and what more can be done in the courts. I don't think we fully tested that, but we, in addition to data privacy legislation, should be looking to ban discriminatory algorithms. And at this point, 230 does not prevent us from going there, and I think we ought to.
Great, thanks. And do you want to come in on this? I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, well, first I want to say that absolutely, I think that this is interconnected. And as you know, Lori, I do a lot of work in Latin America where they have had some of the same problems that we have on the internet and on platforms like WhatsApp and others that are passing discrimination and are affecting their governments in precisely the same ways. Many of them now have totalitarian or close to totalitarian governments in Brazil, in El Salvador, and other places. And I frankly think that our hope might be better if we try to use those experiences in all of the Americas, Canada as well, as a way to put some pressure on the platforms to make some changes throughout the Americas. And the reason that I am more focused on the Americas is because, first off, I'm not very sanguine about the US Supreme Court and what they will do about some of these issues relating to their interpretation of the First Amendment and what kinds of things would be appropriate for us to do. So I'm concerned about whether or not some of the things that have been done in the European Union, while I think they are definitely far-reaching, much more so than we are, what are being proposed, that moderation is one thing, issues relating to altering 230 in some ways and strengthening maybe the Federal Trade Commission or some other organization, some other entity to do more to make certain requirements of disclosure and transparency, but to regulate some of what has the hate speech and some of the other things that have occurred on the platforms is going to be much more difficult in the United States.
Yeah, no, thank you, Anne. That's exactly right. Let me turn to you for a minute. Someone asked a question earlier, and I think it's a good one, about whether, if we drive the sort of, the hate and the, sort of bad actors onto smaller platforms, can we track that and what kind of impact that has? I'd love for you to address that for a minute.
Yeah, of course. This is something which we've looked into in some detail actually, and I think sort of the concerns of perhaps activity going into more difficult to track places or less well regulated places, I think are actually outweighed by the net positive of limiting the reach of extremist voices on mainstream platforms. Now what we know from the data is their audiences decrease significantly if an influencer is kicked off a bigger platform and goes onto a fringe platform. And we see this because they complain about it. So Milo Yiannopoulos, the sort of the alt-right guy, right? He was saying, I literally don't want to be using this Telegram channel to communicate people. What's the point of doing that effort if I'm only going to be reaching 6,000 when I could be reaching millions on Facebook or Twitter? And I think that that's a really important thing because you're making the problem smaller. Now, ultimately, there are going to be a dedicated bunch of people who will hold these views, particularly when you're looking at sort of extremist groups and white supremacists, and they are going to be trying to find ways to communicate and organize, regardless of what the platform is they're on. I think essentially what we really need to be doing is making this as difficult as possible, right? Like, why should they be allowed to use Facebook? Why should they be allowed to use Twitter? These are multi-billion pounds or dollar industries, right? And so I think that making it as difficult as possible is really crucial. Now, and then, you know, we can follow, we can analyze, we can monitor on these fringe platforms. I mean, I do think it is also important to say that some of these smaller platforms need to be tried to bring them around the table as well. So Telegram, for example, the encrypted messaging app, there is a huge amount of incredibly violent, incredibly dangerous conversation going out there. Now, I'm talking about people saying, this is how you make a bomb. Here's a video instructing you on how to best ambush a police convoy, right? Here's how to 3D print a gun. And that conversation's going on relatively unchecked. So I think there is also something to be said around like how we engaging with these smaller platforms, because they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it scot-free. But sorry, that's a very long and rambling answer to say, like, kicking people off, yes, absolutely, let's do more of that. But let's also try and find ways to go to these smaller platforms as well.
Thanks so much. Carolyn, let me turn back to you a little bit on some of the state that we're seeing, and I want to sort of maybe do both sides of the equation here. People have been putting sort of notices about different state laws we've been seeing related to disinformation. Yeah. There's also a tremendous number of laws we've seen happening, you know, that are sort of the voter suppression laws, which are connected to this. Love your take on what's going on there. You know, and also, you know, just to sort of throw out as a prompt, we've seen tremendous spending from the tech companies themselves on these issues in the states as well, which people should not forget about. So not all these laws are definitely, you know, they're being supported in different ways. So let me turn that over to you for a minute.
Right. A number of very good points in the chat about this. It's true, California, number of bills. I think one of them that was referenced is a Jesse Gabriel bill that's largely a sort of a disclosure requirement to make sure that I believe ADL is actually one of the primary sponsors of that bill. It's a good bill. It doesn't do a whole lot to mess with the incentives of the platforms, unfortunately, but it would draw a little bit more attention to the failure to enforce even their own terms of service. I might just call out another California bill, the Buffy Wicks bill, which seeks to protect children online from things like automatic autoplay, you know, on YouTube, things that suck them in, you know, the like button and things like that gives parents more control to protect their kids from things like that. So that's a good bill. Someone mentioned the Florida SB 7072, which is likely to pass. Governor made a big thing of this. This is one of the, we've seen in almost every state, Republican has introduced a bill to allow for pretty hefty fines against media platforms that deplatform a politician or censor conservative speech. And these are message bills only. They violate Section 230 of federal law, and they violate the First Amendment. So I do think they will pass in a few places like Florida and maybe Texas, maybe some others, but they'll be thrown out by the courts right away. They're illegal. So on the voter suppression bills, being advanced on a premise that is that there's sort of massive voter fraud. So the big really allowed to take hold by social media. But the overlap, I think, really does stop there, because the engine behind those bills are partisan Republicans who see voter participation, full voter participation, as a threat to the existence, the future existence of their party. And so no amount of truth and, you know, combating disinformation is going to deter them from their goal of trying to pick the people who vote. And it's a great threat, and there's some great corporate campaigns that are being lodged to try and fight those. But it's not really a matter of correcting disinformation, because these people know they're lying. They're doing it anyway.
Anne, do you just want to talk for a minute about HR1 and S1?
You must have read my mind. I was about to, you know, we haven't talked about that yet. It is now S1. HR1 already passed Congress, but S1 is pending in the Senate. And first off, there are a lot of provisions in it relating to voter suppression. Some things in it that have to do with foreign interference in elections, which often occurs on the internet, in fact, and it also incorporated some of the laws relating to internet and internet platforms that were already introduced in Congress. But so this is the For the People Act, and it's facing a difficult road in the Senate, unfortunately, because it's so comprehensive. But that comprehensiveness, in my opinion, is going to at least go to some degree to deal with some of these problems that we see with respect to voting, many of which are done on platforms and on the internet, such as lying about or spreading disinformation about where to vote or whether you could vote by text or things like that. And so I would say, before we're done, I know you didn't want any statements about what we should do, but people on this call should at least connect with their senators if they haven't already, and say how important it is to pass S1 for our democracy.
That's great. No, that's important information. So thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
So let's turn a little bit to all of the different harms. I mean, I think it would be hard to have, you know, a conversation about disinformation without talking about, for example, COVID disinformation. We just passed Earth Day and climate denial on the internet. We've touched on kids just a little bit, but there's so much there, you know, that we should be worrying about. So let me go maybe first to you, Jake, and then to Jessica. You know, gaming, gaming platforms, you know, I assume a lot of people in this have kids, grandkids. What should they be worried about?
Okay, on the gaming stuff. So this is something which we've been looking at in quite a bit of detail over the past few months. I think particularly with regards to sort of a range of harms, child sexual exploitation being one of them, but also radicalization. mobilization by extremist groups and hate speech. Now, these are all very, very prevalent, or at least all present on gaming platforms. Our analysis suggests that there is sort of significant issues with extremist mobilization on the one hand, but also with normalization of hate speech writ large and the sort of community standards there. Now, the thing is I think, you know, it is essential that we start to bring these organizations around the table. I mean, gaming itself is worth more money per year than the global movie industry and sports in North America combined, right? And the fact that these organizations and these platforms aren't really being brought around the table and aren't having a spotlight shone on them, I think is currently a massive gap and a major gap in how we're approaching it. And I think that really what there needs to be is more analysis, more research, so there's an evidence base there, and then actually bringing these people to the table and having policy conversations, because currently I just don't see it.
Jessica, let me turn to you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely seeing gaming as an on-ramp and misogyny is one of the key tools to recruit people and then move folks along to even more extremist content. But, you know, when I used to work at National Hispanic Media Coalition, my boss, Alex Nogales, used to say, we will be treated as we are perceived. And that's true both in terms of how we're treated in an interpersonal way, but policy and other things as well. So in terms of like vaccine disinformation, we just saw a new poll out from Voto Latino and Media Matters this week that found that Facebook first and local news second were the primary drivers of vaccine disinfo in the Latino community, causing vaccine hesitancy. This against a backdrop of our community being absolutely decimated by COVID, just has absolutely devastated Black and brown communities, Native American communities. And so we're being targeted with disinformation. We know that Facebook and other platforms are not able or willing to moderate content in Spanish up to the level that they've been moderating content in English. So this is a crisis. This is a crisis facing our country, the world, but in particular communities of color. We see specific efforts to target Black and brown voters, to either disenfranchise them or to give false information about election day itself, or about the nature and quality and priorities of the candidates running for office. And so we are seeing targeted efforts to get Black and brown people to not show up to the polls. And in certain instances, those efforts have been effective. So, you know, those are just a couple of examples of the harms we're seeing, but I can't leave this panel without noting just how deadly false information and hate are for our communities. And it's really heartbreaking. I'm not going to bring up every instance that we've gone through in the past couple years, but mass shooting at our sacred places of worship, mass shooting at a Walmart where the shooter invoked the same language that the Trump campaign was running thousands of ads over Facebook, calling immigrants an invasion. That person went to Walmart to kill brown people because Donald Trump told him that there was an invasion. And so it's really hard to not grapple with the trauma and the death and the violence that's happening, that's targeted against the Jewish community, the Muslim community, Black, brown, Native American, Asian American. Gosh, since the hate speech aimed at Asian Americans related to the pandemic has increased hate crimes against that community. And so I'm not telling y'all anything you don't know, but like, this is a life or death issue that we've got to get to the heart of, and we got to cut it off.
Really, so true, Jeff. And, you know, just devastating, you know, that what we see online comes offline in such, you know, a horrible and violent way. So let's think for a minute then. I do want to save just, you know, time at the very end to make sure that we, you know, get your all's recommendation on, you know, what people can be doing right now. But I want to just talk for a few more minutes about platform accountability overall. You know, a couple things happening. We know that the Senate this week is having a hearing on algorithmic accountability. Senator Coons is hosting that. We are anticipating the Facebook decision to, you know, whether or not to let President Trump back onto the platform. You know, where's this going, you know, and what do we think, you know, that we all can be anticipating and expect in the face of that? Jessica, let me start with you one more time, because I know, you know, you spent a lot of time on both the Facebook Oversight Board and the real Oversight Board, which you helped start up, and have spent a lot of time with those executives. And then maybe Carolyn jumping in on just sort of, you know, where you think that Congress is headed with this a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook and the other platforms have a decision to make here. Are they going to be vehicles? Are they going to monetize hate, pain, suffering, and lies? Or are they going to move in the opposite direction? Right now, the status quo is they are monetizing hate and lies. And so they have some responsibility here. I do agree with Anne, we're not going to achieve everything we want to see, all the progress and justice that we want to see through laws, at least not in the United States context. And these companies have a responsibility. I think reinstating Trump is dangerous. We saw disinformation about the election decline by over 70% the week he was banned from social media platforms. His footprint is prolific. He is a repeat and regular spreader of lies about the pandemic, lies about the election, and downright hateful racist nonsense about communities of color. And I think the right call is for him to stay down.
Yeah.
I can't super Congress acting anytime soon, partly because Congress is just so dysfunctional. You know, it's so many just desperate needs this country has right now that Congress is unable to deal with. And the platforms are extremely influential. I think that, you know, their ability, you know, over time. And so I think we are making progress. I do think the insurrection, many members of Congress do think that social media played a contributing role. And so it feels very personal to them. So, you know, I think we're moving in the direction of reform. But, you know, our politics are really dysfunctional. So I guess, you know, in segueing to kind of the, you know, what would you want people to do? I think people have to first and foremost protect themselves and be very skeptical of what they are looking at, what they see online, and make sure their families and friends are skeptical too. I think that, you know, they need to make sure that their members of Congress know that that social media companies need to be held accountable, and there need to be some safety associated with this industry, like there are for almost every other industry. And one other thing, just to call out, because I'm not sure it's come up, but you know, if anybody works for a company that advertises online, it's incredible how many brands unwittingly are supporting websites that promote disinformation. And you know, it's worth making sure that your company's ads are not on these websites. That's, you know, a sure way of both sending a message to, you know, Google and the advertising placers, but also to shutting down some of these malign content producers who the only reason they can function is because they're getting money from ads, online ads.
Carolyn, that's a great point. And there are sources to figure that out. And, you know, the folks at JCPA can help connect people through if they want to learn more about that going forward. So let's just, in our last minute or so here, do a quick round robin of, you know, your best guidance to folks on, you know, ways to fight back on this. And I would love just to remind folks that, you know, the folks you have here you know, represent many different ways to, you know, get engaged and push back, from, you know, sort of highlighting great research to pushing back on the advocacy front to engaging with platforms and to advocating in Congress. So you've got a lot of avenues at your disposal to make that happen. But, you know, in our last minute, we'll throw out a few ideas. So Anne, let me start with you.
Well, I agreed completely with what Jessica was saying earlier. I think it's so important to be able to combat disinformation, to have a stronger local journalism and better local press. And people who don't support their local institutions and local press should do so, and, you know, can give them money. I think the issue, I do also think it's important that there should be some pressure on some of these organizations like Facebook and other, and maybe there'll be some legislation like they've tried in Europe about taxing them for the use that they are making of other people's journalism, and have that money go back to the local journalism in particular. So I think that that's one of the really strong ways that there can be more investigations of these things, and it'll be more transparent. So that is, I think, really significant. And then I'd like to reiterate, this is not exactly to your question, except that when Jessica was talking about targeting, I think that there probably could be some legislation on micro-targeting, because it's not only micro-targeting, it's also geo-targeting. And we know in 2016, for example, that it was this micro-targeting to particularly Black communities, Latino communities, and young people in LGBTQ communities made a difference when they geo-targeted in swing states. And it did make a difference, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people who followed the voting. It could have made a difference in the elections. So that, plus the algorithms and the fact that I think that we may not have hope in Congress, but we should all be pressuring Congress or even locally. And there's nothing that I live in Silicon Valley. There's nothing that those companies hate more than legislation that goes state by state, because it makes it so much harder for them. And so if the federal government won't do it, then we should be pressuring our local state legislatures to be enacting legislation with regard to both of those issues.
Great, thanks, Anne. I know we're a little over time, but Jake, any last words from you on?
I mean, completely everything which Anne, Caroline, and Jessica have said around advocacy around this. It's a crucial area, and I think the more noise which can be made, the better. I will say just two small things. I think there are other more creative ways which we can push back against this as well, which we haven't really spoken about. I think that on the one hand, digital literacy in schools is essential. Actually, building people, providing people with the critical thinking skills to push back against disinformation, but also educate young people on sort of the risks of online space and how to be a good digital citizen. I think that sort of work's important. I think there are other really interesting things actually in terms of taking the conversation online, actually speaking to people who might be expressing support for these for disinformation or for hate and extremism, and try and bring them back through conversation. But I'm aware we're overrunning, so I'll leave you on that.
And then Jessica, final word from you.
Couldn't agree more. Get your people, talk to them, communicate. I did put a shameless plug in the chat, freepress.net. We're actually organizing campaigns, really low bar, as low of a bar as just signing a petition, both facing the companies, but also Congress to move the kind of changes we want to see. So you could sign a petition, or you could make a call to your member of Congress, all different kind of actions you can take, and we'll get that coordinated and up on our website at freepress.net.
That's great. Thank you all for taking the time this afternoon for Sunday. We really appreciate all the information for all of you joining us today. We look forward to working with you for any of you who want to continue this conversation and the actions. So thanks.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Lori.
Bye.